Welcome, everybody, to the NFL Show on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. The NFL Show is brought to you by Replenishing Care and Technologies. Make sure you check them out at rcandt.com, especially the PEMF machine, which you'll be seeing more about, especially live shows wise, in the next few days. I am your co-host for the NFL Show, Mike Goodpaster. Right now, I'd like to welcome in my co-host, NFL beat writer, NBA beat writer. He just writes all kind of stuff. Sam Teets. How you doing, Sam?
I'm doing great, Mike. How about you?
All right. Today, we're going to talk about the top 10 players of the 1950s. Over this past week, we've done the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Today, the 1950s. And the 1950s, to me, are the first time where the NFL actually becomes a viable professional sport. Because up until that time, Sam, it was college football, and then professional football was kind of the ugly stepchild of college football.
At that point, I think even during that time, like amateurism in a sense was being promoted more highly than professional sports, not just in the sense of football, but at the same point, you had so much uncertainty with the NFL or with the league because of how teams were popping up and teams were going bankrupt and stuff like that. And you eventually get to the point where you finally have some stability here and you suddenly have a league that's starting to settle in.
All right, so who do you got at number 10 for the 1950s? And this is the first decade where I was not alive. Go ahead.
So in the 1950s, I've got Joe Schmidt at my number 10 spot. He was a linebacker for the Lions. And I got two or three Lions on my top 10 here because the Lions had a couple championship runs during the decade. Joe Schmidt was around for two of them. He's a six-time first-team All-Pro at linebacker. I think there were a couple linebackers I considered from this decade, but I ultimately went with Schmidt as one of the higher-ranked ones.
All right, the thing about Joe Schmidt, he actually became the coach of the Lions in the 60s also, I believe, wasn't he?
Yeah, he did. He has a coach. He was there for like 5 or 6 years. It wasn't like too eventful, but they did have a 10-year win season from what I'm looking at.
Well, wasn't he the coach in 1970 when they made the playoffs against the Dallas Cowboys?
Yeah, and they lost that one. So it was like what? Detroit's one playoff appearance from like the 60s up until like the early 2000s or something like that.
Well, no, it would have been, I think, 58 or 59 was their last playoff appearance until 1980. What was the strike year? 82? Because I think they made the playoff strike season. They lost 31-7 to the Washington Redskins. But the interesting thing about Joe Schmidt, he was in the movie Paper Lion about George Plimpton and his ill-fated attempt to go to camp and be an NFL quarterback. Have you seen that movie, Sam?
Like, I think you can ask at this point, if you ask me if I've seen a movie, the answer is probably no.
Do you know that movies exist, Sam?
I do know movies exist. I just haven't seen one in a while. I haven't seen a movie in a long time.
I haven't either, but all these movies I saw were a long time ago. All right, my number 10 is Norm Van Brocklin, who was the quarterback for the Rams and then later on the Eagles. Van Brocklin was selected 37th overall in the 1949 draft, taken in the fourth round by the Rams. Now, teams weren't sure he was going to play in 1949 in college or the pros, which is why he fell so far. And he signed with the Rams, who already had a legendary quarterback in Bob Waterfield. And in 1950, the Rams coach, Joan Stidehar, actually solved the problem by taking turns on who the quarterback was. And the 1950 Rams scored a then record 466 points, which is 38.8 points a game, which is still a record. They had a great passing attack, featured Tom Fears and Elroy Crazy Legs Hurst. Fears led the league that year, set a record with 84 receptions at the time. Van Brocklin Waterfield actually finished 1-2 in passer rating. They were beaten by the Cleveland Browns in the 50 title game, 30-28. The interesting thing there is that was Paul Brown's Browns, who had come from the AAFC, a different league, and then in their first year won the NFL title. In 1951, they split the quarterbacking duties again, where they won the championship, and that was the first championship the last Rams championship until 1999. And Van Brocklin actually went on later. Still, I think he got him to the championship game in 55. And then he goes to the Philadelphia Eagles. And I know we're talking 1960s, but in 1960, after retiring, he came back to play under famed coach Buck Shaw. And Van Brocklin was given total control of the offense and basically steadily improved from 58 through 60. And in 1960, throwing to his favorite target, Tommy McDonald, the 1960 Eagles became the only team to beat Vince Lombardi in the playoffs or in the championship game to win their first championship or their last championship until, of course, Nick Foles. But my number 10 is Norm Van Brocklin. And as you can tell by how much I talked, I really like Norm Van Brocklin.
Oh, yeah, I think his career really changed when he came back for that 1960 season because he actually won the MVP that year. And, of course, they won the Super Bowl or they won the championship. So for that 1 year, it really changed his legacy. I think it would have been a Hall of Famer regardless, but I think he really became an NFL legend by having that one great year.
And Greg Gorecki agrees with me. It's a great movie and another movie you need to watch. See, we can't even do a top 10 football movie show of all time because you've never seen a football movie.
That's true. I mean, I've seen a couple, but probably not enough to do the top 10.
All right. My number 9 is Jim Brown. The reason he's this low, if you listened yesterday, he was my number 1 in the 60s, but his pro debut wasn't until 1957. He was just getting started, but even those 3 years, he was dominant. So my number 9 is Jim Brown.
My number 9 was Norm Van Brocklin, but you already covered that pretty thoroughly. I do think there was a case to be made for Bobby Lane potentially having a spot. I know he was more – he played a little bit in the late in the 40s and then early into the 60s, but Bobby Lane had some good years in the 50s, and they had 3 NFL championships. He ended up winning with Detroit. So I feel like Bobby Lane's a guy who was highly underrated for what he did during his time in the NFL, but I don't think I could have him in the top 10 in this case.
Yeah, I think this. Bobby Lane, the fact that he won a world championship with the Detroit Lions is all you need to know when you talk about his greatness.
Yeah. I mean, you can't hear many quarterbacks or many players who say that.
All right, number 8, Sam.
Yeah, my number 8 is Emlyn Tunnell. And Emlyn Tunnell, during the decade, 9 Pro Bowls, 4-time first-team All-Pro. He won a championship, and during those 10 years, he had 59 interceptions. So he's one of the league's all-time leading players when it comes to interceptions.
79 for his career.
Yeah, 79 for his career. I mean, that's an incredible number. We've never seen anyone approach that in the modern history, or in the modern era, I guess you could say, in recent history. So I have him at number 8? I think you could make the case he could even go higher, honestly, but I have another defensive back immediately ahead of him at number 7.
All right. My number 8 is Sam Huff, 5-time Pro Bowler. Huff, along with the aforementioned Tunnell, made the Giants defense. The first was a true identity. And aside from his tackling, Huff was good in coverage too. Also recorded 30 interceptions. And Sam Huff, was a great football player. And he was a bedrock on the New York Giants of the 1950s, which was at least the last half of the 50s kind of a dynasty. So my number 8 is Sam Huff.
See, I don't have Sam Huff on my top 10. I don't have him and Bill George. Those were 2 linebackers I considered, but took Joe Schmidt over both of those guys.
Yeah. Well, sometimes you just make a bad pick.
Or sometimes you just make a good pick. You never know. But
yeah, I made a good pick. You made a bad pick. It's how it works on the show usually, right?
Yeah, it seems to be a trend here. But my number 7 is Jack Christensen. He was defensive back for the Detroit Lions. Again, I'll bring up the Lions because they were winning a lot during that decade. He won 3 championships during his time with the team, or maybe it's just 2 with the team and 1 as a head coach later on. I'm not entirely sure. But he made 5 Pro Bowls, 6-time first-team All-Pro. In a fairly short career, he didn't have a lengthy run. He recorded 46 interceptions, and twice in those 12-game seasons, he had 10 interceptions 1 year, and he had 12 interceptions in another campaign.
All right. My number 7 is Emlyn Tunnell. And the thing about him, he was the first African-American signed by and the first to play for the New York Football Giants. And the interesting thing about him is I saw an interview NFL Films did with him a long time ago where he said that he hitchhiked from his family home in Garrett Hills to New York City to meet Jack Mara to actually be signed. And you look at him in 1949, he was selected all NFL AAFC player. He was only in his second year. As a rookie, Tunnell appeared in 10 games, intercepted 7 passes, including 1 returned 43 yards for a touchdown. And between 1949 and 1952, he was known as the best pass defenders and punt returners in the NFL. And, he was a key to the Giants' famous umbrella defense to shut down the passing game of almost every opponent they faced in the early 1950s. And he was referred to as being the Giants' offense on defense. You fast forward in 1950, he ranked 2nd in the NFL with 305 punt returns and 4th with 167 return yards. So this kind of guy was kind of like the Deion Sanders of the 1950s.
Yeah, he did quite a lot. He's gone down in the record books. But at the same point, he's not someone people talk about often when discussing the greatest defensive backs of all time.
Yeah, and a guy, I don't know how that's possible because of his 79 career interceptions, and which are still a record, and it's still easily a record. He had 1,282 interception return yards, which were an NFL record for 4 decades. He had 58 punt returns, which when he retired was a record. I still think he ranks top 20 there. He had over 2,200 return yards, which I think still top 30. And he played in 158 consecutive games. So Emlyn Tunnell is a guy you hardly ever hear brought up, but he should be because the guy was one of the greatest players in NFL history, Sam.
Yeah, it wasn't. It shows, like you said, by the numbers and by the consistency. But unfortunately, he's just one of history's more forgotten players, despite everything he accomplished.
All right, my number 6 is Johnny Unitas, who quickly went from an unknown college player to a legend. He was a Pittsburgh Steeler too, Sam, for a while, and they cut him.
I know.
That's back when the Steelers front office wasn't as good as now, I guess. And, you had the legendary performance in the 1958 NFL Championship game against the New York Giants. He had a record of 40 straight games with a TD pass that began in 1956, and that record lasted for a while. But Johnny U, I think he was ranked higher on our 60s list. But once again, when you're making the top 10 in 2 different decades, it tells you you're an all-time great. Johnny Unitas definitely an all-time great.
Yeah, I agree. That's why he's at my number 6 as well. We agree on that one. But I just wish he'd stuck around Pittsburgh. I just wish he stayed with the Steelers, didn't go to Baltimore and play for the Colts.
Yeah, but the Steelers were such a mess back then, we probably would not be talking about Johnny Unitas if he would have stayed there.
Well, yeah, I know, but there's a slim potential, just the slightest bit of potential that maybe he turned things around and gets Pittsburgh to win a little bit.
There's not a chance in hell because the Pittsburgh Steelers had nothing around him then.
Yeah, but I think getting out of Pittsburgh probably elevated Johnny Unitas to the point where he got to in his career, especially because they had such a great supporting cast there with guys like Green Berry, letting more of those kind of players to really help him out. Yeah,
and the defense wasn't half bad either.
No, the defense was great too.
All right, who do you get at number 6?
That was my number 6. Johnny Unitas was my number 6, but my number 5 is Chuck Bednarik. I think I said the name right, Chuck Bednarik.
Chuck Bednarik. But what was it? Bedrock Charlie.
Yeah. No, Concrete Charlie, I think was the name.
Yeah, Concrete. What the heck?
Yeah. He was a hard hitter, though. He was actually like one of the first guys you can go back and hear players talk about how hard he hit and how terrifying it was to actually get hit by him. But during the decade, he was a 7-time Pro Bowler, 5-time first-team All-Pro linebacker, also played center for the Philadelphia Eagles. So I think he was like, you got guys who were that versatile, was that good at both positions, but also one of the most feared hitters possibly in NFL history. I think it's really good to have someone like that in the top 10 list.
All right. My number 5, Elroy Crazy Legs Hirsch. And he was part of that with Norm Van Brocklin, Bob Waterfield. He set a NFL record at the time with 1,500 receiving yards. And that is despite the fact that the NFL season was how many games long, Sam?
12.
Exactly. He set a single season receiving record that stood for nearly 2 decades. He averaged 124.6 receiving yards per game, which was an NFL record through the end. That's still a record, isn't it, Sam? It'd have to be.
It have to be close. I can look it up right now, but I would think it'd be very close. Let me look it up.
Yeah, he tied Don Hudson's touchdown reception record in the season in 1951 with 17, which would still be a huge number. And on his 17 touchdown catches, he averaged 51.2 yards, including a 91-yard reception. That was longest the longest of that year in the NFL. And I think Crazy Legs Hirsch, when you look at him as a guy that, let's face it, all these guys are kind of forgotten because it was so long ago. But Crazy Legs Hirsch, you watch the film and the feet he had, he could still play football today if he had to.
Yeah, let me say this. He had more receiving yards per game than Calvin Johnson did in the year where he had almost 2,000 receiving yards. So I think he still has that record because it would make sense that
it's a 12-game season.
What? Yeah, it was so much shorter season, so I would think it would make sense that you still hold that record. I don't have my top 10. It's possibly my greatest omission is not having him.
Oh, my God. What do you mean you don't have – how can you not have him in the top 10?
Listen, you kind of talked me a little bit into it, but I didn't have him in my top 10.
I don't have to talk you into it. All you got to do is look at the stats.
Well, he had one fantastic year. He had 2 pretty good years, but I don't know. I don't have him in my top 10.
You know you're wrong now, don't you, Sam?
I feel like I'm getting wronger by the minute, but I do feel a little bit bad for leaving him out there. But My number 4 is Gino Marchetti. He was, of course, the defensive end for the Baltimore Colts. You talked about that great
Gino
defense.
Marchetti. Come on, you youngin'.
Marchetti.
Gino Marchetti.
I tried to get by it with saying it correctly, but 6 Pro Bowls, 2-time first-team All-Pro, 2 NFL championships during the decade. When we did the top 10 defensive ends, I think you and I both had him on our list, like around the 6 to 5 spot. So he's one of the greatest defensive ends of all time, and I think we can't ignore him because he was really dominant during this decade.
Yeah, I've got him at number 4 also. And the thing about him, if you watch the film, he was doubled and triple teamed all the time. He reached 11 Pro Bowls and made the all-NFL squad 9 times, which means he was one of the 2 best defensive ends in football 9 times, basically in a decade. He was a part of a great, legendary Baltimore Colts defense. So I'm going to agree with you on this one with Gino Marchetti at number 4. My number 3 is Chuck Bednarik, which I think is kind of crazy. You didn't have him higher, Sam, but I mean, they called him the last of the 60-minute men. He played both ways, D-line, O-line. He led the Eagles as both a center and a linebacker, earned 8 Pro Bowl selections, and Chuck Bednarik was the last of his kind. And when you watch him play, I don't know, have you ever seen the hit he put on Frank Gifford?
That's the one I'm talking about. That's the stuff I'm talking about, yeah. I mean, he, like I said, he's one of the best dominant hitters from the early era of football.
All right, who do you got at number 3?
Now, hear me out on this one. I have Jim Brown all the way up at number 3. One spot basically for every year he played in the 50s. He's only there for 3 years, but he led the league in rushing yards per game each time, 2 MVP awards, and he averaged 105.5 rushing yards per game during his 3 years in the 50s. I think we can make the argument he's the most dominant player in the 50s, despite only being there for 3 years.
I don't think you can.
I don't think I'm maybe not above the guy who I have at number 1, but I think you can make the argument he's close. He's our second or third, which is why I have him at 3rd.
Yeah, I think you're really pushing it off of 3 years, Sam.
Maybe a little bit, but like I said, 3 rushing crowns in 3 years. He kind of reset the position in terms of what you were expecting from running back. So I'll stick with it. I think you can make the argument for 3.
I think you can too. I don't think you can make an argument higher than that, though. My number 2 is Dick Night Train Lane. And the thing that's really amazing about Night Train is he went undrafted. And it's really amazing when you consider he intercepted 14 passes in his rookie campaign of 1952. He had 68 interceptions in his career. But the thing about that 14 passes, we remember Lester Hayes in 1980 with the 13 interceptions to stick him. You know, it was kind of iconic, Lester and to stick him. That was 16 games, and he had 13, and everybody thought it was blown away by it. Night Train Lane was 14 in 12 games in his rookie season, and he was undrafted. And I think you're going to have a hard case for me to be able to tell me that the 8 or 9 years he played in the 50s could be superseded by Jim Brown with 3 rookie or with 3 rushing titles.
Well, that's why I have Night Train Lane number 2. Jim Brown's my number 3. I wasn't going to overlook him. Now, you talked about the greatest defensive backs, greatest cornerbacks in NFL history the other day. You brought up Mel Blount. We were talking about Deion Sanders in that conversation as well. Where do you think Night Train Lane lands? Because I think you could make the argument he's a top 3 kind of guy.
I think he lands at either 1 or 2 with Mel Blount.
See, that physicality. There was a reason he's called Night Train Lane, remember? Take the guy's head off back when you could.
Yeah, back when you were allowed to decapitate a dude. Now the world's so soft. If you take somebody's head off, they get mad at you, Sam.
Yeah, you can't have none of that anymore. But back then, you can go back and watch some of the tapes, just some of the hits he laid into guys where he basically goes up and launches himself on a guy's head and knocks him flat on his back. I mean, it's fun to watch.
Yeah, it is. That's why I don't watch the NBA anymore, Sam. They don't fist fight anymore.
No more Bill and Beers.
No more Lambeers, Mahorns, Maurice Lucas. That's when men were men. They
would knock guys around too. Can you imagine now with the NBA? You used to be able to take a guy out when he's going to the basket and just be normal, but now you take a guy out going to the basket. It's probably a tech, I would think.
Oh, I remember watching Kevin McHale, grab Kurt Rambis around the neck and slam him into the basket support, and the Lakers shot a one-shot tentacle.
Yeah.
Nowadays, Kevin McHale was removed from the NBA.
Yeah, now it'd be like, how many games are he going to be suspended for if he did something like that? It would be.
Yeah, that's sad. I remember when you used to be able to watch a hockey game and be guaranteed to see a good fight.
Yeah, you still get some of those now. At least I think they probably allow the most of any sport.
Not as much as they used to be, and everybody's softer now. Maybe not in the NHL, but I don't know. So sports are just soft. Hell, part of the fun of being a man's getting in a brawl just for the hell of it.
Yeah, but that's the way it is.
You wouldn't know. You've never been in a brawl in a bar, have you, Sam?
Well, no, probably not. I'm only 21. I just got to the point where I could be.
Well, see, back then we'd go to the bar when we were 15. We'd fight our way in and drink anyway.
Oh, well, nope.
All right, here you got it, number 2.
As my number 2 was Night Train Lane, but my number 1, I think you probably the same guy. It's got to be automatic Otto Graham, right?
Got to be Otto Graham.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way you can take someone else. We talked about some of the best passers, or even just the evolution of playing the quarterback position. Otto Graham is one of those front runners, one of those forefathers, kind of the modern passing game in terms of what he did. He led the NFL in passing yards 5 times, led it in touchdowns 3 times, yards per game, I think another 5 times. Passer rating was a lot too. So he did basically everything you could ask him to. He's one of the all-time greats. I don't think that's questionable.
Yeah, and I think about Graham is when you look at him, what was it? Every year he played, his team played in the championship game.
I don't know. I think there might have been a little bit of space there in the early 50s where they didn't, but it was almost every year. In the 40s, definitely. I know every year in the 40s they did.
Yeah, but they were in the AAFC then, which didn't mean so much. Because that league was not very good. They dominated that. They very rarely even lost a game, if I remember right. But it also helped that, he's playing for Paul Brown. And, things were different with Paul Brown. And when you look at the players around him, I mean, he's handing the ball to Marion Motley. He's throwing to Dante Lavelli, Max Speedy, all guys that you could make a case for, I think, at the bottom of this list. And, I mean, he was an amazing quarterback. And he was, more important than anything else, he was a winner. And he's a guy that I think that totally gets undersold because I don't think you can have a top 10 of all-time quarterbacks list without having Otto Graham on it.
Yeah, we got Greg Gorecki in the comment section again saying 10 years, 10 title games for Otto Graham. But I think you have to have him.
That means I was right again, right, Sam?
Yeah, pretty much. That's what I'm hearing. I was kind of trying to skip over that point, but that's what I'm hearing. As far as Otto Graham goes, I think you have to make the argument that he's a top 5 quarterback of all time in terms of what he did. So you talked about the winning. Even during the decade, during the 50s, 3 NFL championships, 51, 13-1 as a career record as a starter during the 50s. So I think you have to make the argument he's one of the top 5 greatest quarterbacks of all time, potentially.
Well, and a lot of people will say, well, he didn't play the kind of competition. But I think with the less teams, you probably had better competition. You only had the best players.
Yeah, you didn't have any kind of watered down.
7 out of 10 championships. I mean, come on. How many Tom Brady won? There's Greg. 7 wins.
Yeah.
7 out of 10.
Exactly. So it's pretty good for him. And like you said, there's no watered down competition. You're not playing weak teams necessarily because you're playing all the best players that are available. So I think you have to make the argument he is one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time. I don't know if I would say top 3. I would say possibly top 5 or 6.
Well, 7 out of 10 makes it hard not to be top 3. Because what would your argument for Tom Brady being the best quarterback of all time be?
Probably either it'd be wins. So for Otto Graham would be the wins argument as well.
I mean, nobody will do that just because it happened in the 1950s. So most people didn't see that, so they're not going to respect it. Plus, you always hear, it's like a Cowboy fan talk to an Eagle fan before they win the Super Bowl. Well, you guys never won a Super Bowl. Well, we won it all in 49 and 1960 or 47 and 60. And Cowboy fans will always invariably, because they're Cowboy fans and don't know any better, will say, well, that doesn't count. Well, it does count. And just because it happened before you were born or before they called it a certain thing doesn't mean that it doesn't count. Which is why, as a Bengals fan, I will tell a Browns fan, at least I've seen my team in 2 Super Bowls.
Yeah, and there's another thing. There's another thing to add to that. Like we said, the game was tougher back then too. People will say it's less level of competition, but you could do a lot more to opposing players back then than you could in the modern game. So you might be able to make the argument it was even hard to win necessarily, or even hard to play the game back then.
Well, I think this. I don't know that it was harder to win, and the reason I say that is the same reason that I believe Vince Lombardi was not as great as Bill Belichick, because with that Cleveland Brown team, Speedy, Lavelli, Graham, they got to keep those guys. They didn't have to worry really about losing them unless they wanted to lose them. So you didn't have to replace a certain portion of your roster every year, where Bill Belichick's probably got to replace 25 to 30% of his roster every year. Paul Brown didn't have to do that. Vince Lombardi didn't have to do that with the Green Bay Packers.
Well, like you said, Bill Belichick, they've basically been through how many iterations of their defense at this point? They've been through like 4 different iterations of Patriots defenses in the past 20 years.
And yes, Greg Gorecki, the Grey Cup has been around since 1909. Now I got to explain to Sam Teets what the Grey Cup is.
CFL championship, right?
Yeah. Name 3 CFL teams, Sam.
They changed the name. Montreal changed the name, didn't they recently? Or later?
No, they didn't, Sam. They didn't.
Wasn't there one team named the Inuits? I thought it was one of the teams.
The Inuits? It was the Edmonton Eskimos, which is named after Inuit tribe. But they're changing the name of the Edmonton Eskimos, which I don't know. What's your opinion, Greg, on the change of the Edmonton Eskimos name? Because I don't like it. I mean, from everything I hear, it's not really considered a derogatory term to the Eskimos, I guess. I don't know, and if it is, I apologize to all the Eskimos. I just called Eskimos. But come on.
Edmonton was the team I think I was thinking about, but I messed that one up.
Sam, you got to start catching up to actual professional football, because I actually enjoy watching the CFL more than the NFL.
Hey, to be honest, right around like 2015, I spent a long time watching the CFL 2015, 2016. I spent most of the season back then, but I haven't watched it, like I said, in 4 or 5 years at this point.
Well, seeing a lot of guys that were successful in the NFL failed in the CFL. Vince Ferragamo, you remember Vince Ferragamo led the Rams in a 1979 Super Bowl? You know, he goes and spends about 6 weeks in the CFL and gets cut, and then comes back and still takes the Rams to the playoffs.
I think people do underrate the CFL, though. I think from what I've heard, it's actually very competitive and it's a very good game. It's not something that you can just throw away. It'd be better competition even in the XFL, I would say.
Well, I mean, look at all the coaches and players. Joe Kapp, before he won the 1969 NFL MVP, he was a CFL quarterback. There you go, Greg Gorecki. The majority of the Inuit do not have a problem with it, actually. That's the same thing everybody tells me, because we did up until this year, where there's been no CFL season. Myself, Brian Schmidt, and Robert Drummond, who won, I think, 4 or 5 Grey Cups up there, playing for a couple different teams. Yeah, there you go. 1 season, 7 touchdowns, 25 interceptions for Vince. Then, if I remember right, I'm talking to Greg because Sam's young. If I remember correctly, Vince Ferragamo still came back. Didn't have a ton of success in the NFL, but I think he did help the Rams make it to the playoffs one more time. But either that, or it might have been 80 where he took him to the wild card game, and after that went to Montreal. I can't really remember. It's been a while. You still haven't given me 3 CFL teams, Sam. I figured you've had time to look it up now.
I should have been doing that, probably, but I wasn't. I'll say the Montreal Alouettes, I know that one. Edmonton was the team I was talking about earlier, but I messed that one up. And the other one, I know there's one in Winnipeg, and there's one in Ottawa. I don't know the names, though. I don't know
the Blue Bombers and the Red Blacks. Now, the Ottawa used to be the Rough Riders, which was confusing because Saskatchewan was the Rough Riders also.
Yeah, that would have been a little confusing. They changed the one, not the other?
Changed the one, not the other. Yeah, well, actually, the Ottawa Rough Riders ceased to exist, and then they brought them back years later and just changed the name to the Red Blacks. And there you go. I was right. So Vince Ferragamo took the Rams to the Super Bowl. He took them to the wild card game, and then he threw 7 touchdowns and 25 interceptions in Montreal. But also
not a great way to end your career.
It's a different style of play, too. You got receivers coming downhill in motion. I mean, you got to have a little bit more arm strength to be able to throw outside the hashes because it's a bigger field. Hold on. Let's see what he's got here. We got Greg again with Billy Johnson, James Scott, Fred Biletnikoff, as well as Tom Cousineau. Yeah, Fred Biletnikoff was on that team. I remember Cousineau played on that team. Cousineau went on to play for the Cleveland Browns after that, if I'm not correct. And he was a decent player, but he never turned out to be as great as Browns fans thought he would be. But what have Browns fans ever been right about anything?
Nothing recently. Nothing since Otto Graham, apparently.
All right. Here you go, Sam. What quarterback won 5 straight Grey Cups in the CFL? Late 70s to early 80s. This is low-hanging fruit.
Doug Flutie.
No, Warren Moon.
Oh, come on. Oh, I did know that.
That was easy. That's a Hall of Fame NFL quarterback, and you missed it.
Oh, I knew that. I did know that
Cody
one.
would have been late 80s into the mid 90s before he came back to Buffalo and San Diego in the NFL. He won a bunch of Grey Cups up there too for Toronto, which Robert Drummond, who we used to do the CFL show before it ceased to exist. But what's Greg wants you to be careful about? I bet Greg's related to Tom Cousineau. Was it 5? I think he won it, 78. He won it 79, 80, 81, 82, I believe, was Moon. But Greg's a Browns fan. I'm sorry, Greg. I'm a Bengals fan, so I'm just as pathetic, if not more pathetic, than you. At least you had the 50s and 60s. Of course, if the Bengals would have had a team in the 50s and 60s, they'd have been fine too. Bengals
just like how Joe Burrow's going to lead you to 10 straight Super Bowls, right?
Yeah, Joe Burrow will lead us to 10 straight Super Bowls. As long as he doesn't decide to protest and sit out the rest of his career.
It's all right. The Bengals will mess him up anyways. They'll do something stupid.
Yeah, probably. Same way the Browns will mess up Baker. It's what the Bengals and the Browns do. But hey, somebody's got to be 3rd and 4th in the AFC North. All right, Sam. I don't know what we're talking about Monday, but we'll discuss it. Numbers weren't as good for the 50s, so we might as well cut this top 10 thing off.
Yeah, might as well. That's what I was thinking too when I was watching the number live, but we'll figure some topic out.
All right, Sam. Tell everybody where they can follow you.
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter at Sam_Teets33. I'm constantly posting new stuff there every day, so feel free to go check that out.
Yeah, there you go. I forgot about Tom Wilkinson. Tom Wilkinson was the quarterback in 78 because 78 Rose Bowl would have been more Moon, I believe. So 78 Rose Bowl would have been January of 79. All right. I forgot about Tom Wilkinson. I want you to be able to tell me all about Tom Wilkinson when we come back Monday. We're actually going to do a top 10 CFL quarterback show of all time, Sam.
If you really want to, I could try to pull that off. It'll be hilarious to watch me fail, but I could try doing that.
It's hilarious to watch you fail every day anyway, Sam. All right. You can follow Sam at Sam Teets 33.
Yep, you got it.
There you go. You can follow me at Grueling Truth. I want to thank Greg, as always, for chiming in there with the Tom Wilkinson, who I actually forgot all about until he brought it up. But Tom Wilkinson was actually a really good quarterback in the CFL for a while for the Edmonton football team, I guess, now, since you can't call me Eskimos anymore. But all right, we'll be back Monday at 1 o'clock Eastern. You have a great weekend also, Greg. So for now, for Sam Teets. Oh, don't forget our sponsor, Replenishing Care and Technologies, RCANDT.com. So for Sam Teets, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening or watching, according if it's a podcast or a video, to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.